Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I would say Arto's presentation was very nice introduction to mine, which you can see we did the similar exercise for Estonia. If Estonia would take the ambition to move towards climate neutrality, what would it mean? What would be the costs associated? What would be the impacts? What are the options, policy options that we need to consider, or the actions that we should take in order to go there? So we just completed and presented this week the report to the government's Climate and Energy Commission on Monday, and I'm extremely pleased to say that today there was a government cabinet meeting, and Estonian government decided to support the EU Cleaner Planet for All communication and initiative. So there's one less country in the world on path towards climate neutrality. And as everywhere, there's the very heated debate around it, getting close to religious one. Then I very often also ask, similar to this cartoon, that but really, if we invest into these things and reach a future where we have sustainable ecosystems, cleaner air, cleaner water, and so on, which are all the go effects of, I think, the investments that we are talking about, is that really bad? But coming closer to Estonia then. So what we did, first, you can see the emissions based on greenhouse gas inventory, which is the basic unified methodology that is used in the European Union to assess where the countries are, what's the progress made or progress not made. So you can see at the top the emissions based on the last inventory available for Estonia, and the total emissions were somewhere in the region of 90 million tons in 2017. And where we need to reach in order to have a chance to reach climate neutrality in Estonian context is somewhere in the region of 2.2 million tons of emissions. There is important note that indeed, due to the ETS price pressures, probably 2019 emissions in Estonia will already significantly drop from the power sector, because the ETS currently is giving a strong price signal and pushing the oil shale-based electricity out of the market at the current price levels. But there's still quite a long way to go. But climate neutrality, it's two sides. One side is the emissions from different economic activities, and then there's also the removal of CO2, which is called the land use change and forestry sector, LULUCF. So when forests grow and grow faster than they've been used in a wood industry, and you have a stockpile of forest, then it sinks the carbon or removes the carbon. The same is with the natural grasslands and so on. So in forested countries like Estonia or Finland, this could act as a balancing buffer, meaning you don't have to go to absolute zero with your emissions, but you can have this CO2 removal from LULUCF sector. If you're using also your natural resources and this buffer actively and don't take care of this side, then to reach the climate neutrality, you would have to use also carbon capture storage, carbon capture utilization. Otherwise, the numbers will probably not add up. If you look at the current pace, then as Arto was saying, for the Europe or for the Nordics, that we are not on a track reaching climate neutrality with existing policy measures. Although, as things are, yes, indeed, ETS system is putting a lot of pressure, giving the right direction, but there are still several different things that are missing or hindering the investments. At least in an Estonian context, you would have some regulatory barriers, you would have planning barriers, you would have the issue of regional market prices, which are creating uncertainties around the investment. So you need to take additional steps if you want to induce also the new investments. For the purpose of illustrating how big is the task, is it something easily doable or will it require a significant effort? We put together one possible climate neutrality scenario for Estonia. In the context of the study, what we also created, we created a modeling tool that allows to use these different policy measures that we analyzed as a Lego pieces. You can pile them, switch them in, on and off in this modeling tool, and you will see what would be the effect if you implement or not implement this measure, or if you implement only half of its potential. So for each of the possible instrument policy measure, we also calculated what would be the estimated maximum amount or extent you can utilize it, what would be the costs associated, what would be the impact associated, and then we piled them up on top of each other to show what is the amount of activities and investments you have to make in order to reach this 2.2 million CO2 equivalent emissions with CO2 removing LULUCF sector. So yes, as I said, it's illustration of a path forward. What is very important, and this relates very much to what Arto was saying, this scenario and the price tag was developed on the assumption that you would want to have your security of supply based on a domestic resources and capacities. As we have seen over the last 10 years, Estonian and also other Baltic markets, energy markets, are very much and very rapidly integrated together with the Nordic power markets. Yes, there are still limitations to the interconnections, but you see that it would make very much sense to do this all regionally together, because it makes sense to make hydro where it works the best. It makes sense to develop wind parks where they're most cost efficient and so on. It makes sense to develop bio-based CHPs, again, where it makes sense. So in this context, it's important that probably you can reach, or not probably, you can reach climate neutrality with a significantly lower price tag. But then it comes also your willingness, societal willingness to rely on imports. Is it 20% that it's okay to import? Is it 50% of the energy? What's the percentage? Depending on that, the price tag of the whole climate neutrality scenario will decrease as well. But obviously, having a very efficient regional power market decreases the costs for everyone in this region. And in this scenario, what we then put on top of each other was that in order to meet the energy demand in 2050, you would require, again, if you would want to do it based on domestic capacities, you would need around 700 megawatts of solar power. You would need 1,300 megawatts of offshore wind parks. It's vice versa. And then onshore, 500 megawatts. You will need a balancing capacities. Again, this is very much depending on what's going on in the region and where do these balancing capacities, where will they be built? But it's clear you cannot add in Nordic Baltics huge amounts of additional renewable energy without also investing into regionally the balancing capacities. Also, what we assumed is that reaching climate neutrality would mean significant changes in transport sector. it would mean more than 500,000 electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles. Out of the 11 terawatt of electricity consumption in 2050, almost 1 terawatt hour would be from the electric cars. And that's the picture of, increasing electricity demand and the possible capacities to meet this. From the emission reduction side, obviously the biggest, given that Estonia's energy has been historically very much oil shale based and dominated by it, the biggest share of emission reductions would come from energy sector. The second biggest one would be transport and buildings, and then LULUCF sector. And the required investments, again, the same three sectors will dominate. It's the energy sector, building and transport. What is important is that we, because it was the study was commissioned by the government office and on behalf of different ministries, the key question was also how much what will it mean in terms of budgetary impact, and who will then pay for the bill? And what came out was that actually most of the investment would have to come from private sector. It's the companies and private consumers. And only 24% of the costs will be borne in this scenario by public sector, because also public sector is also owner of a lot of building stock. It's also running public transport. It has car fleet and so on. So it's the areas where they would have to, public sector would have to invest themselves, but it also includes the support and subsidies that would be required in order to incentivize possible investments. Well, the total number that we calculated for this scenario was 17.3 billion euros. And there was also obviously a big response. That seems like a very big number. But then if you think about what does it mean in 30 years context, because we are not saying that these investments will have to happen in the first quarter of next year, it's, if you break it down into different decades, and we see that a lot of the investments would have to be made in the next decade, because it makes very much sense to invest a lot into also energy efficiency in the next decade, because these investments will start generating savings, which are important twofold. First, it's the direct savings and lower cost in the future, plus the more energy and resource efficient, the less you have to invest into new carbon neutral, climate neutral capacities in the future. So even if you say that let's do the front loading of the activities into the next decade, it would still be around 4% of GDP. And that's in a very much similar neighborhood of the numbers that you were talking about. So just a sample of some of the measures that were analyzed. And also, this was kind of the tool finally that we developed, that you would have sectoral possible measures that you can implement. Then there would be a number, how much CO2 reduction does it give? What's the marginal cost? Every ton of CO2, how much does it cost using this policy measure to remove it? What is the overall total investment requirement for the total period? What's the share of public sector in this? What's the impact on jobs? What's the impact on GDP? So, and our message obviously is that while there are so many different policy options where to do the energy efficiency, probably it makes sense to start from the bigger target groups. For example, continue with the apartment buildings, put more focus on private residential housing. This is one of the areas where Estonia has done not so much currently. It's an unused potential. There are significant energy-saving potentials there. But there's also a lot of in retail buildings and industrial buildings, possible saving. And what is important that, for example, if we talk about the retail sector or industrial buildings, these are some of the most cost-efficient energy efficiency projects. There you would have the second column green, meaning this is very cost-efficient from a future savings point of view. Electricity production, then here also, you have a certain big blocks of choices. Offshore wind farms, nuclear as an option. Again, we showed that it will have significant impact on a CO2 reduction, but it also quite significant investment associated. Out of this 17 billion, it's 2 billion if we're talking about 600 megawatts. And there's a very, very long lead time to it, and there's a very strong regulatory hurdles and other hurdles. So even if you start having the debate now, there's a lot of uncertainties, and that's why I think we've seen other carbon neutral technologies going faster forward, because it's just faster and easier to do. Plus the very rapid decline in technology prices. But then you would have also a number of smaller options related to district heating, renovating the boiler houses, doing the fuel switch. We are talking about street lighting and things like that. But you can see that these are significantly smaller in their impact. So probably the key issue of making fast progress is still in the things that I showed in my last slide. And also choices that affect investment needs in the future. If we are talking about the LULUCF sector, then one of the things that would have very significant impact is afforestation. Just last week there was a news that within a context of climate summit, African countries agreed to create a wall and plant a forest in order to mitigate and counteract the desertification and heat concentrated in the middle part of Africa. So even in Africa, there's a lot of cooperation and debate going around it. And similarly in Estonia, we have currently Estonia is preparing new forestry action plan. And the key issue is, shall we try to aim for a high level of carbon removal by using our forests? Or not. So there has to be balance between the interest of wood-based industries plus the ecological and climate aspects of using our bioresources. The transport, I would argue, is the most tricky sector. In energy, I think it's the huge chunks of activities, but at least you know where you have to go and you know the steps ahead quite well. Then the transport is tricky because you have to change the car fleet, you have to improve the public transport, you have to improve the city planning, you have to make the modal switch that would support moving the goods from roads perhaps to rail. You would have to make also the modal switch in terms of how to try support that people would drive less by cars? What will be the impact of car sharing or autonomous driving? What would be the climate impact? We don't know yet, but it's clear that you would have to do quite a number of different things and small bits, and that's difficult, making the changes with small bits. So the biggest chunk, of course, is changing the car fleet. And if we look at currently the sale of electric cars in Estonia, we are very much lagging behind Norway and other leading countries. So there needs to be definitely a change of pace to happen. And if we talk about agriculture, then yes, there are also some of the things that can be done, improving the manure treatments or neutralization of acidic soils. But in overall picture, these are the bits that I think help the final 5% of the road to make. The biggest challenges still are related, and solutions are related to energy, housing, and transport. But it's also about new businesses and sustainability, how it's integrated into the overall business thinking and mentality and business models in different sectors. So all in all, although we bring out that some measures are more cost-effective than others, then what we say is that in order to reach climate neutrality, you also have to implement those which are not bringing the savings but adding costs. But what is important, that in total, actually implementing these different measures, both the cost-saving ones and cost-adding ones, that would be a total, on average, that would be societal savings. And very, very sensitive issue has been the oil shale energy. There has been a strong shift and desire to move from electricity production from oil shale to the oil production, and government has also been presented by the sector ideas about adding oil shale capacities in the future as well. What we said is that if Estonia would support in further investments into oil shale-based oil capacities and also refinery capacities in the future, it would add 1 million ton to the overall picture of emissions, which means reaching climate neutrality will become much harder. You can do it by then just saying that we will switch off these capacities, December 2049, and it's done, statistically climate neutral, or then you would have to have a higher CO2 removal from the LULUCF sector, or then you would have to have carbon capture and storage solutions implemented. But overall, our report said that it would at least be risky from a regulatory point of view, and also quite sensitive and vulnerable to the global CO2 prices. So talking about impact of going climate neutrality then. As I said, one thing is that these measures, when implemented, would mean economic savings at the societal level. It would mean also restructuring of an economy where energy and labor-intensive activities will be replaced by more capital and technology-intensive, knowledge-intensive activities. And obviously, the total impact will depend on which exactly of these measures will future governments choose to implement, and how will the government complement these investments with investments into R&D, technology development, innovation policy, how will it link to the work done in universities, in the companies? Because we are talking about direct, immediate impact. But obviously, Nordic countries have shown that you can create a business out of it. The same first mover advantage that was being discussed. This is also a choice for Estonia. Do we want to be the last ones to import the solutions and just implement, or do we want to be one of the first ones to implement in certain areas and complement it with the innovation policy and future new businesses, build new businesses around it? So this is just, again, to illustrate that if you invest in the first decade, you will have the economic savings in the future decades. Direct impact on GDP would be negative, especially in the transport sector. Why? Because the calculation methodology was taking into account that if we don't change the taxation structure, the revenues and also the tax revenues from the transport sector and transport fuels, retail sector, will decrease because the car fleet will be significantly more energy efficient in the future. But in terms of jobs, actually these investments will mean overall added new jobs. So all in all, climate neutrality in Estonia could mean less money spent heating the air, reasonable use of local energy resources, investment into new jobs, new innovative products and services. It will also mean reasonable management of forests and ecosystems, reduction in waste generation, and also what is important, decreased vulnerability by global risks, taking care of that side. And where to start? We said you don't have to lock in the strategy and action plan for next 30 years. Technologies will develop, the markets will develop, but there are several kind of no-brainer things where to start. You would have to start from investing into energy efficiency, that's first, then starting decarbonization of the energy carriers, and that goes to electricity, heat and transportation, and then because the removal side, natural removal side is important, then also lay a clear path how much do we want to invest into this afforestation and LULUCF sector. And these investments don't happen by themselves. So what needs to be done now as a next step is there should be sectoral discussion with the stakeholders. Okay, if we want to move forward, if we want these investments to happen, what shall we do? How do we remove regulatory barriers? How do we support the planning side of it? How do we create, jointly investment opportunities for both public sector and private sector? And how can we complement then this with also the innovation and R&D policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Lauri. I saw many questions popping up, and Lauri will be joining a panel afterwards, but we can take a few. So can we have those on screen? So the one is, what drives you crazy in current climate, excluding climate change, denying? Or I think that's not only the temperature-wise, but the environment or communication in the society.
I've been working, I think, for the last 15 years already in, at the intersection public-private sector, so almost nothing drives me crazy anymore. I've developed quite a thick skin. Actually, I would say I'm very optimistic. My optimism has grown. I was working as a director of energy department 10 years ago in the Ministry of Economy, and I remember back then it was much harder to have other ministries engaged into this topic. It was kind of, you have to do this, there's European, obligations towards renewables, and somehow it was this annoying burden. But now what I see is really positive developments that you both have in public sector, much bigger openness to discuss and cooperate on these issues, that people feel that it's a shared issue, not anymore, it's somebody in the Ministry of Environment should do it. And I see also in business sector, there's much bigger interest towards it. It used to be that you would have, corporate social responsibility officer doing the greenwashing brochures, perhaps, but now it's actually substantial, part of possible business model. So I would say, yeah, I'm more optimistic than annoyed or being driven crazy by the debate.
Okay, good. And I'm taking some of the questions to the panel as well, but one question that is here, and that was raised before, how to ensure that industry and transport sectors are participating in CO2 reduction efforts, and that was about agriculture. That was also asked before. Like some sectors are like not that interested, kind of, because it costs them more than others, but they are also quite usually the ones who have the biggest kind of part in the CO2. So there is lobbying efforts there. So what do you think how is that playing?
I would think that what will happen, again, given that there is a new commission and the commission president is very committed to climate neutrality, I think during that course, when all of the member states start reporting how the progress is and they realize that perhaps not enough, then I would think that there will become this discussion about widening the scope of ETS. What you see regarding the transportation already, there's a push, regulatory push, not on a demand side, but on a supply side, in a sense that you have the increasingly tighter regulations on the cars. So car manufacturing, the average CO2 emissions of cars produced and sold in Europe are already getting tighter and tighter. So I think what you see is that a combination of different demand side and supply side measures getting tighter. But if you look at the transportation sector as well, I think you see many logistic companies and others also realizing it's an issue. It's an issue for branding purposes. It's an issue of actual cost savings and competitiveness. So, for example, Bolt just announced we will have, I guess, mentioned this, the Tech Green Pledge. Bolt, one of the biggest car sharing providers globally, announced that they would like to become carbon neutral by 2030. So there you go. I think both will happen, that the front runners will start doing more, and this inspires the change for the others to keep up, and you would also have the increasing regulatory pressures.
Okay, good. Thank you, Lauri.